Hi, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for what promises to be a very exciting discussion on the politics and political risk within the Middle East and North Africa. Before I introduce our esteemed guest and speaker today, I wanted to run you through a little bit about GlobalWonks. Many of you know about us and our products and our business, but many of you don't, and we're delighted to have new friends and colleagues and potential clients and experts join us today. So GlobalWonks is the world's first real-time expert network. We connect businesses and experts around the world across sectors and industries. To date, we've got 10,000 experts in over 200 countries that are working with some of the world's leading companies, ranging from large tech companies to Fortune 50 companies and banks to universities and large NGOs. And our goal is to maximize three core components of the global insights and knowledge business: to deliver expert insights quickly, compliantly, and to expand the bandwidth of experts around the world. Our key product is Network Pulse, which delivers real-time insights to clients around the world. Think of it as an expert Q&A tool. So if you want to learn more about GlobalWonks, please email Will Jessup, who will get in touch with everyone here with the recording of this webinar later this week if you want to see a demo of our platform or want to learn more about our products. So let's get started. One of the key motivations of introducing a COVID-19 webinar series was that GlobalWonks sits at the heart of what is one of the biggest challenges today, and that is informational asymmetries, both for businesses and private sector clients, but also for workflows and consultants around the world. So what we wanted to do was bring together our very rich community of experts and present them to our clients, our community of researchers, experts, friends who wanted to learn more about our products, but also get to learn about the insights and the quality of insights that our experts have. And so today we kick that off with a webinar series on political risk in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, of course, oil prices, tourism, and capital markets have been hit quite significantly by the coronavirus and will have an impact on the region's economies and knock-on effects for international trade and beyond. But how do we get to understand that chaos and what kind of a world will be left behind after this crisis begins to abate? So for the next hour, I'm delighted to have the webinar series get kicked off by one of our most esteemed experts on our platform, but also my former boss and teacher, Vali Nasser. Vali is the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Between 2012 and 2019, he served as the Dean of the school, and between 2009 and 11, as Senior Advisor to US Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. Vali has a rich career spanning academia, policy, and as a globally noted voice on US foreign relations and the MENA and South Asia region specifically. And on these subjects, he has advised senior American policymakers, world leaders, CEOs, and investors, including the President, Secretary of State, senior members of Congress, and presidential campaigns. As a scholar and author, his articles and monographs have been original and prescient, from one of the first serious intellectual histories of political Islam in his debut book to his 2007 piece, The Shia Revival, which continues to influence military officers and policy thinking across the globe. And most recently, to an early assessment of what the international system and the Middle East specifically would look like with a retreating American role that is on full show today. Among many academic, private sector, and think tank affiliations, Vali is a member of the International Board of Advisors of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and of course, on the advisory board of GlobalWonks. He received his BA from Tufts University in International Relations and earned his master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where he was also a professor for 5 years. He gained his PhD in political science from MIT. Vali, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bilal, for inviting me to this webinar. It's really great to participate in this event with a venture that I've seen start from the very basic first days. And I'm very glad to see it thrive and to see that it is so relevant to events of the moment. Our topic today is to think about how COVID-19 impacts the Middle East and how to think about political risk in the region. And I want to start by sort of a debate that we're having in discussions of international affairs, and that is whether or not once the pandemic passes, there's going to be a snapback to the old order, or that many of the institutions and assumptions of the international liberal order, the international economic order, are going to come back. And I think Middle East is a good place to think about this and to see whether order within the region will come back and whether the way in which the region fitted into the international order would come back. And I want to put a set of ideas on the table for us to think about and maybe discuss, largely because there's no clear answers to these, but there are indications for the short run and medium run. And to put the conclusion up at the beginning is that it is very difficult to see that after this pandemic, that the Middle East will be the Middle East of old that we knew, and that the challenges and the assumptions are going to hold as they had done before. The pandemic is stress testing right now state institutions and regional orders. And some states and regions, like in Asia, are coming through very well. And some regions and states, including, for instance, the state in the United States, are not coming through this very well. Now, there are issues for businessmen to think about in the short run, which is largely, do projects come back? Do industries and sectors that the region has been associated with regain their momentum? And then in the medium and short run, what are the sorts of things we ought to think about? So the very first issue is that the pandemic is first and foremost is a massive economic hit to the region. Not only it has impacted its trade relations with China, with Europe, demand for a lot of its products have collapsed. And most importantly, demand for oil has collapsed. And then the oil wars that have gone between Saudi Arabia and Russia have been quite devastating to the region. And this is not only to the big oil producers, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, but it's actually across the board. The collapse in the price of oil has impacted other producers from Oman, Kuwait, Iraq, Algeria, and also many other states that rely on the largesse and aid or trade or migrant remittances from the oil states. And one could say that in fact, we could look at UAE or Saudi Arabia and say, yes, they're going to be hit, but that the hit is not going to be very big and they can survive this. But the International Monetary Fund, for instance, is not at all sure about Iraq. It's not sure about Kuwait. It's not sure about Oman. And it's very clear that across the Middle East, the impact of the pandemic is that the social contracts between the governments and their societies and the kind of economic planning, economic visions they've had are not tenable. These are not going to be sustained. And when social contracts break down, then you can have political consequences follow. Now, in GCC countries, the biggest hit is that the massive expectations and visions that were created for the population are not going to be sustained. So these societies are not going to grow. Vision 2030 is not realistic anymore. The ideas of an anthropo economy, tourism based for UAE, Qatar, is not going to work in the post-pandemic world. And then social contracts between governments in Egypt, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Jordan, in Turkey, in Iran, with their populations are not going to be sustainable at the levels of income and global demand that we're going to see in the post-pandemic period. So everything I'm saying basically says we should expect regime change and major changes in regimes to be coming in the Middle East. We don't know the shape of these, but they are definitely are going to be in the offings. And as I said, we have populations that had high expectations of growth and improvement that are not going to get it. And there are populations that are going to see degradation of state institutions because of the collapse of the economic model going forward. So we're going to have a lot more political turmoil internally within the Middle East, and we're also going to see, if not state failure, at least a number of system failures in various places coming in the Middle East. A second issue to keep in mind is that the Middle East has been a place of a lot of conflicts. That's the way in which it has captured imagination in the West. We've had wars in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. We've had ISIS. We've had war in Afghanistan. We saw that the West had already started winding down some of these wars. The US is talking about leaving Iraq. It's talking about a peace in Afghanistan. The United States has washed its hands of Syria. This trend at some level is going to continue. The level of corona infection in Afghanistan and Iraq is so large, although underreported, that it's very difficult to see that US troop presence in that territory within the next year or two could be sustained. Already we saw the French withdraw their troops from Iraq because of COVID. The United States is repositioning its troops in Iraq because of the pandemic. And anyways, it's a very good excuse for President Trump or the next American president to actually withdraw their troops from the region. But withdrawal from, and also just let me add that Saudi Arabia, also under a tremendous amount of economic pressure, has even taken very bold step to end the war in Yemen. So some wars that we are familiar with are going to wind down, but we're going to see other areas of conflict open up, and we're going to also see these wars as well as the economic issues create migration problems, conflicts that are obviously going to visit on Europe, going to have secondary, tertiary effect on Europe, but also beyond as we go forward. A third issue is that the United States is now leaving the Middle East on a much more accelerated pace. It already was taking its foot off the gas in the Middle East, but given the degree of economic problems in the United States, polarization of its politics, social political breakdown, the bevy of international challenges it faces in confrontation with China, in clashes with Europe, in managing a post-pandemic world, that its attention in the Middle East to the kinds of issues that had brought it in, namely chasing terrorists or trying to contain Iran or get in the middle of a Saudi-Iranian rivalry, is going to be far less visible. I mean, the United States is going to turn inwards, and it also is going to turn its attention to putting out much more important fires than the ones in the Middle East. So the region essentially is going to go through a period of turmoil, but the terms of the conflicts that are coming are going to be set much more by dynamics in the region rather than by the United States. On the other hand, I believe China is going to be a much bigger player. China is coming out of the COVID pandemic, ironically, as a much stronger and more aggressive international player. It has understood that the only way to get ahead of the bad press that it's going to get, or pressure or pressure to marginalize it because of the pandemic, is to be much more aggressive in terms of addressing the problems that the countries have. Level one is, of course, providing all kinds of medical, pharmaceutical, and technical assistance to countries right now, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq. They're all receiving a lot of love and affection from China, a lot of support. But after this might come financial support, and also that the Chinese are becoming much more aggressive in terms of defending the turf and reputation around the Middle East, and are likely to play a much more important role in order to defend that. We don't know what financial capacity China might have to actually help countries when IMF or the United States won't, but likely it's going to be much more than it is at the moment. And finally, I would say that most countries around the world, and Middle East is not an exception, now look at China as a much more viable socio-political model to follow in dealing with the kinds of challenges that the pandemics has presented than looking to Europe or the United States for that matter. So China presents now a much more of a opportunity for look east for the Middle East than had been the case before. So China to some extent is going to step into the breach. And finally, I would say that obviously the two most important countries to watch in terms of the dynamics of regional balance is what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia and in Iran. And I think right now talk about a regime change in either place is far-fetched and premature, but there's going to be significant shifts. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, the consolidation of power, which was tied to a much more grandiose international agenda by the Crown Prince, connected to Vision 2030, connected to maximizing Saudi Arabia's oil wealth in the short run to change the profile of the country, has got a big hit. Now, the challenge for Mohammed bin Salman is, can he reinvent himself? Can he be a legitimate, stable monarch if he is not at the same time transforming Saudi Arabia? And also, how is he going to deal with the expectation of a population that was told that they're going to be a major economic global player by 2030, but actually are going to be much poorer a population going forward? Already we're hearing that the government of Saudi Arabia is contemplating 20 to 30% cut in budgets of all ministries across the board. That's going to have a political impact, and that's going to impact the way in which Mohammed bin Salman's power has been positioned so far. Now, in Iran, the most important impact of COVID-19 is to be a force amplifier to American sanctions. So it's truly bankrupted Iran's economy because the imports from China dried up, exports to Iraq, Turkey, and the neighborhood dried up. Iran's non-oil manufacturing fell apart, and then whatever oil they were selling got devalued because of the entire market getting glutted and devalued. And also because they got a lot of flack at the beginning for allowing the pandemic to spread out. Although the Iranian press, ironically, have extensive coverage of incompetence in the West. And that obviously the Iranians now look at Italy or look at Spain or look at Britain, United States, and they think if these Western powers with all of their resources can be fumbling, then their own government cannot be faulted the way that the world community had faulted them. And in addition, it's not that the pandemic is impacting the regime. It's not regime versus society. Within the regime, ironically, the hardline Revolutionary Guards and the Basij militias have come out of this much better. They've set up hospitals. They've been much more on the ball in helping with the quarantine. Most of the disinfections around the cities have been done by the militias. And on the other hand, obviously, the civil society has risen to the occasion, and the medical professionals have done very well. It's difficult to see that the Iranian system can continue as it did before, taking sanctions in the chin and continuing unabated, that somehow it has to open up its economy in order to survive. But internally, there's now a much more, I think, decisive shift in the direction of more centralized security services, IRGC, Revolutionary Guard Center administration that can get things done, that can cut through the red tape and the decision-making in Iran. And we might see a much harder Iran coming out of this pandemic, but one that might be willing to engage with the world. And I think if the United States becomes less involved in the Middle East and Iran is able to keep it together, it is best positioned of all the countries in the region to actually assert its dominance. So in an ironic way, much like China, if the Iranians can keep their system intact, they may end up being in a positive position. Let me stop here and we can pick on any of these threads, and I would love to hear your questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Vali, for that wonderful overview, and a lot of salient points there for us to consider, and that are actually quite thought-provoking. I'm going to jump in and ask a few questions that look to go a bit deeper on what you've discussed here today, but I'd also encourage our participants to just click at the bottom of their screen on the Q&A tool, and they can submit questions that we will try to get to and get through as many as we can in the 40 minutes remaining. I thought one of the really clear red threads that came through what you discussed was the movement of people, right? And so the region has seen fault lines, but also economic progress around this idea of movement of people. The refugee crises born out of the civil wars of the last decade have put neighbors under infrastructural and economic duress. Expats from around the world and low-income laborers have helped propel and build modern economies in the region. And we've also seen minorities toggle back and forth between their religious identities, but also nationalist commitments, often in a combustible way. And we've seen all of this pour out, both in terms of progress, but also most recently, protests and other forms of collective action. Governments have responded oftentimes by having doubling down on a nationalist drive, by trying to build more nativist economies. COVID-19 is, to my mind, likely going to double down on that, especially with threats to travel, food security, labor markets overall. So how do you see this sort of broad movement of people impacting not just political thinking amongst the MENA governments, but also economic thinking, and how should businesses and investors in the region or interested in the region think about this issue?
It's a very important point. Let's start with the most positive. So part of the labor and people's movement, and that is the large numbers of expatriates who work in the Persian Gulf countries. These are from low-end laborers, Sri Lankans, Filipinos, Pakistanis, to high-end labor, which is Australians, Europeans, Americans, who work in these economies. Now, it's difficult to see that, first of all, the tourism and the globalization sort of sector in the Persian Gulf rebounding very quickly. If travel, if demand in the West, if demand in the East is not there. And also because one of the issues that pandemic is putting on the table, we don't know, is exactly the problematic of movement between societies of labor. So if generally the post-COVID world is much more restrictive about coming and goings of labor, that obviously impacts the Gulf countries. The sense about Gulf countries has been that over a 15-year time period, it's expected that particularly Saudi Arabia and Kuwait or Oman would be running through their oil wealth and also a lot of their sovereign wealth, that they would have become poorer, and therefore their demand for expatriate labor was going to start to dry off. And many of them are putting in programs to try to get their own population to do this work. We see this in Saudi Arabia. What COVID has done is actually to accelerate this process. And the impact is not in the Gulf, the impact is in the countries that are sending these labor there. So if 1 million labor in Saudi Arabia goes down to 100,000 over the next 2 years, that's going to have a major impact on Pakistani economy. Not only it's going to end up with 1 million labor coming back, but it's going to lose billions of dollars in labor remittances that the government budget relied on. On the issue of minorities, majority, this is really a social contract issue. Let's say if a country like Iraq, if its system begins to disintegrate as it's right now on that course, not only because Iranian-American tensions, but because at the current oil price levels, even the Iraqi government can't even meet payroll. And if it cannot basically provide the sustenance to minorities, Kurds, Sunnis, we're going to see alternate political social compacts arise, demands for autonomy, clashes between minorities and the center. I mean, things like this are going to become more prevalent. A lot of states that are keeping together because the state is able to subsidize regions and minorities may no longer hold. And the issue of migration is much more tricky. if migration is directed at getting rid of excess labor by having them get on boats or trek all the way to Europe, it becomes a European problem. And we saw with Syria that you know, being complacent about this is dangerous, because the impact of Syrian refugee crisis on Europe was quite significant in terms of giving rise to populism, damaging European communities. So Europe could be in line for a sort of a second wave coming out of MENA because of the collapsing economies and the rising conflicts that come out of the MENA region. Now, the more complicated you know, risk factor here is the impact of migration within the MENA region. In other words, if more Syrians or more Iraqis begin to pour into Jordan, which is already weakened by you know, a lack of economic growth, or they begin to pour into Turkey, or that kind of shift within the region, can have consequences on countries that right now in of themselves we might expect should be doing much better than would otherwise be the case. But we have to be expecting labor migration for the simple reason that if systems in the Middle East begin to atrophy, begin to weaken, you're going to begin to have economic migrants. And then if we end up in conflict, much more significant conflict, then we're going to see a larger groups of people cross borders in varieties of directions.
Thank you. And I think one of the key things there that comes out is looking at the intra-regional level. And so, you know, one of the key shifts that we saw come to a head over the last 5 years has been these changing alliance structures within the region itself. So we saw fissures amongst GCC partners with the Qatar blockade, the droplets of a thaw in Arab-Israeli tensions, specifically Saudi-Israeli tensions, and of course the ratcheting up of Iran-Saudi relations, to name a few. Now, over the past few weeks, we've seen some diplomatic outreach at a high level during the crisis itself. So do you envision that these tensions that had been growing over the last sort of 3 to 5 years and had been coming to a head, this could be an opportunity for some of them to turn to a head, especially for commercial purposes? We see that the Expo 2020 is this year. Qatar is gearing up for the International Cup later this year, and then preparation for the World Cup as well. There is a lot of potential lost commercial opportunity and business and opportunities for growth, which will be priority number one after the crisis. Is there an opportunity in space to enhance the pace towards an economic recovery if some of these tensions can be ratcheted back at the intra-regional level, as you mentioned?
Well, particularly if the United States steps out of the way, and these countries have to deal with a combination of strategic, domestic political, and domestic economic issues, their calculations may begin to change. And they may see, in some cases, benefits of collaboration and cooperation. And in other cases, the opposite may be true. We are already seeing a changing sort of shift in the axis in the region. For instance, the UAE took a major lead in providing Iran with medical assistance early in the crisis when Iran was in desperate need of it. I think they sent about 100 tons worth of medical equipment to Iran, pharmaceutical goods, and the Iranian government officially thanked UAE for that gesture. Saudi Arabia, for instance, did not take such a gesture. There was no, COVID did not provide any kind of an opening. The Saudis are now trying to negotiate peace in Yemen. We'll see whether the Iranians will end up being helpful there or not. But you know, I don't see immediate commercial opportunities in the region, because I think everybody's dealing with the same set of problems, which is a collapse basically in the revenue streams. And the largest portion of this revenue stream is actually oil funded, particularly in the case of the Gulf countries. So with no tourism, including Hajj in Saudi Arabia, with oil prices potentially being soft, let's say, for the next 2 years and maybe beyond, I think whether you're looking at Iran or you're looking at UAE or you're looking at Saudi Arabia, they all are dealing basically with the same set of problems. And it's not clear that there's how cooperation within the region is actually going to provide additional revenue streams. But I think peace in the region, at least not shooting at one another, agreeing to a kind of a truce and reducing tensions, may allow each of them to be able to focus their attention on their own domestic sets of issues, which is stabilizing their regimes, trying to negotiate new social contracts, and try to find out how they're going to jumpstart their economy. If this trend persists, then we can see major changes. So let me just sort of throw a hypothetical out there. If 3 years from now, the Saudi economy is still weak, and you begin to see Saudis leaving Saudi Arabia, well, one of the destinations they may decide to go to is UAE. So the migration issue for UAE will not be Pakistan or Iran. It actually may be right now they're close allies. So how would UAE or Qatar or Kuwait deal with, let's say, large influx of Saudis who think they might have a better living standard if they move to UAE and Saudi Arabia? And that makes for a very different dynamic within GCC. So GCC right now, its self-definition is really to be anti-Iran. But if Iran is no longer the biggest problem for these countries, then you might have a very different kind of a configuration in the region.
I want to expand out a bit from commercial interests as they pertain to the GCC and think more broadly about the region as a whole, and especially how the US-China rivalry plays out in the region more broadly. You know, over the last several months, we've seen protests ratcheting up across the region, economic growth in some of the better performing countries slowing down, and proxy conflicts and wars going up as well. I remember you telling me some years ago that at the height of the P5+1 negotiations that the Iranian regime has a long historical arc when it comes to diplomacy. Now, with that said, and with Iran and Saudi being such key players in how we think about risk across the region as a whole, the current crisis presents both an opportunity and risks for major global powers, such as the US and China in the region, right? To put it more pointedly, do you think something like the nuclear deal, which has pretty significant knock-on effects in terms of commerce and conflict for the region, can be salvaged in some form or another, either under the current US government or the next? And I thought it was very interesting, and I think for many counterintuitive, that China's going to come out punching above its weight in the region after the crisis. And so do you think its path to that kind of domination has actually been cleared by the way the US has dealt with the region thus far, both prior to the crisis, but in the way it's showing signs to do so in the next year or so, which is why many are calling this Washington Suez moment. So just would love to see you go a bit deeper on that.
So, you know, we could always sort of surmise that Arab governments are willing to explore maximum amount of confrontational risk with Iran if they are sure of US support. Even if we went a year back when the Iranians attacked the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia and downed the US drone and the United States did not respond, it was followed by UAE opening a channel with Iran and Saudi Arabia sending messages that they want to de-escalate. And then when you had the killing of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, the Saudis basically closed that channel, and so did the UAE. So US is a big part of the calculus of how far the smaller, wealthy GCC countries want to go in terms of confrontation rather than cold war or cold peace with Iran. And secondly, the US also, particularly this administration, is egging them on and essentially is asking the Gulf countries to hold fast against Iran and defend the maximum pressure strategy. So this is now a case that often It's the United States that is polarizing the region rather than essentially defending one side in an already polarized region. If the United States washes its hands of the Middle East in a much more effective way, you will actually have much more realpolitik there. So the Saudis or UAE or Qatar would have to sit down and think in terms of how do they manage Iran or manage Turkey or manage one another, for instance, without the United States being in the middle. What would be the balance between diplomacy, cold peace, aggression, military confrontation that they want to actually engage? There might be a lot more give and take in the region without an aggressive, active United States. And then if the economic pressures in the region are going to force the governments to prioritize domestic politics. And ultimately, they will have to wind down some of their international operations. So the current financial crisis in Saudi Arabia, because of the drop on price of oil, is one of the biggest motivators why Saudi Arabia has taken such a big first step in declaring a 2-week ceasefire to bring the Houthis to the table. It would, if oil had remained at a high price and Saudi coffers were full, probably Saudi Arabia would not have thought about how do we quickly end a multi-billion-dollar-a-year war. So you know, we're going to see different dynamic out here. Now, China is not going to be sending aircraft carriers to the region anytime soon, but it's going to be a much more important voice, largely because it's going to play an important economic role. It's going to be a source of financing for the region. It still is going to be the most important purchaser of Middle East oil and other products that the Middle East produces. Belt and Road Initiative may not go at the pace that it did before, but it's going to continue. And so, and I think the Chinese inclination in the Middle East is not to encourage countries to fight one another. That doesn't help Chinese economic project. It's to encourage them to somehow work together. And I think we may see a very different prospects. Now, one issue which is very key, and you hinted at, we don't know what's going to happen in November in the United States. It's now more uncertain than it was in January of 2020. And I think every country in the Middle East is hedging. So the chances of the JCPOA being revived is much more if the Democrats came back in. And even under President Trump, but particularly if Democrats came back in. If you have the scope of problems that the United States is facing, does it really want to sort of risk a water confrontation in the Middle East? Probably not. I think the inclination would be to sort of dial this back and see how you could keep the nuclear deal going and not have to deal with a nuclear problem in the Middle East same time as every other problem. The rulers in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, in Qatar, they are all now very closely watching what's going to happen and what does it mean for the region. How does the United States behave internationally post-pandemic under a Democratic administration or under a second term of Trump administration? And that's a big part of the risk analysis for the Middle East. And as it is for other regions of the world. And the answer to that is not known. And what it's creating in the Middle East is much more of a wait and see approach. And people are sort of looking at scenarios about, you know, what sort of an international order they're going to be dealing with.
Thank you so much. Let's reach out to well, all the questions we've received, and we're receiving many questions that are coming in from all our participants. Of course, this webinar will be distributed to our clients, so I will keep those who are asking questions, their names and identities anonymous. But to get through as many as possible, Vali, perhaps I'll ask two at a time, and you
Sure.
you can answer them in whichever order you wish. So the first one is a straightforward one in the way it's written, but perhaps not as straightforward in terms of the answer. Could you comment on implications for Russian involvement in the region? And that's question number one. And the second is, has there been a shift in the ability of Israel to influence events in the Middle East, either from the pandemic or the exit of the US from the region?
On the second point, I think the big impact on Israel would be one would be that it's bet on Sunni Arab governments of the Persian Gulf being a big player that could anchor Israeli policy in the Middle East and help contain Iran, perhaps is open to question now. If these countries are internally focused, are economically weak, may become destabilized, and may be seeking a different kind of foreign policy, that kind of a regional axis against Iran may not be as critical. On the other hand, the Iranians may face a lot more problems in Lebanon and Syria, and their ability to support Hamas, Hezbollah, and Syria might also weaken. But you know, the overarching animus between Iran and Israel is not going to go away. Now, the Russian involvement is a bit more complicated. You know, Russia has had an important role to play in conflicts in the region, largely because Russia has significant amount of hard power that is willing to deploy and is willing to do these things. So Russia has obviously interfered in Syria. We've seen that. Russia is now getting involved in Libya. And if there are other conflicts in the Middle East that spring up, whether it's in Iraq or somewhere else because of the collapse of systems, you could see Russian involvement. Russia has also, you know, played a role of a psychological, you know, supporter for regimes like Iran or groups in the region who have thought that Moscow will back them, is able to provide them with strategic support, will defend them at the United Nations. And that's very much the case in relationship between Russia and Iran. Russia had until now very good relations with Persian Gulf countries. This oil clash with Saudi Arabia is interesting to watch. Yes, President Trump came in and negotiated a deal a few days ago. We'll see if it holds. But I think the way in which the Saudi crown prince basically decided to teach Putin a lesson when the deal was not being made in the first place, that he basically pulled all the plugs, provided the discounts for oil to European countries who are Russia's customers, maximized Saudi production, and flooded the market with the aim of disciplining the Russians, was sort of a first, if you would, clash between Russia and a Middle Eastern country, although it's in a commercial arena, but it's a clash that actually has hurt the Russian economy significantly and was sort of a public humiliation of Putin, or at least an attempt at a public humiliation of Putin by the Saudi crown prince. And so it shows both the limits of how Russia can be friends with everybody, but we also might be at the beginning of seeing Russia play a much more sort of gloves off role in the Middle East, because at some point, Moscow may begin to react to the Saudi maneuver as well. Russia does not have the capacity to play the economic role China has. It does not have the capacity to play the military role the United States has. It sits somewhere in the middle, but in many conflicts or tussles where you just need a little bit to tilt the balance, like was the case in Syria, Russians can play an important role.
Well, a lot of Sovietologists might come out of the dark if Russian gloves come off. Two other questions we have here, both very important, and I don't think we've touched upon them too deeply. The first is, what impacts do you suspect that COVID-19 will have on the spread of the Islamic State and other terrorist groups in the MENA region, especially considering an even quicker US withdrawal? And the second, and I think potentially somewhat tied, is, the increasing contributions that China is making to economic development in the Middle East. You've touched upon that, etc. But a common question that also comes up is China and its role in succeeding the influence that the US has in thorny political issues. So those are two questions that we've just had come in that would be great to get your thoughts on.
Well, I don't think the Chinese are going to sort of step up into negotiating big things like the Yemen war or Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli issues. But I think they might influence the overall tenor of behavior in the region. So the Chinese commercial influence, political influence is more directed at collaboration, cooperation to promote commerce rather than to support different team sports in the Middle East. For instance, the Chinese want to do business both on the north shore of the Persian Gulf and south shore of the Persian Gulf. They don't like to be deciding between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They don't like to be pressured by Riyadh or Tehran to have to choose. And they would like those countries to get along enough for the Chinese to operate in both places. Now, I think the more the United States disappears and both Riyadh and Tehran have to look to China for varieties of things, the more they might sort of take signals from what the Chinese want. For the Iranians to behave and for the Saudis to behave and to find ways to create common ground. That's the Chinese inclination. I think the question is not Islamic State per se. We will see a more conflictual Middle East. We will see more likely more states gradually losing control of different parts of their territory. We're going to see systems fail. We're going to see weak economies that's going to create ethnic wars, tribal wars, as well as terrorist wars. And these may start in Iraq actually, because it's a state that is in deep trouble. Its government is literally melting away under economic pressure of low oil prices and U.S.-Iranian conflict. It hasn't been able to even form a government, proper government this year. It's hugely infected by COVID-19. So you could begin to see that the compact that's keeping the Iraqi state together can come apart, and it might revisit internal conflict, if not a full-fledged civil war. But the thing to keep in mind is that terrorism may end up being much more of a Middle East problem than being a global problem. Because part of the entire global appeal of terrorism was that it could capture the imagination of the West, and it could make itself into a global actor and a global preoccupation for the United States, for Europeans. Terrorism now has a tough time competing with the virus. It cannot pose the kind of existential threat to Western economies that this virus has done in the past year. And yes, terrorism will arise and the West will respond, but the kind of out of proportion response that we saw after 9/11, or every time there was a terrorist attack, I think is a thing of the past. I think terrorism has been now put to death in some ways by the virus. And yes, there are voices in the West who look at every ISIS attack and are trying to argue that we need to get back into Syria. But I think that's a really, really hard sell to Western populations to say that you really need to take this thing so seriously as to send troops into Syria to fight this thing. And I think terrorism is going to be there, is going to be preoccupation, but has been sort of cut at the knees, and it's been demoted in terms of priorities for the West.
Thank you for that, Vali. We have two questions coming that I think, again, dovetail off one another, because they bring into light some of the middle-income countries or emerging growth countries in the Middle East. So the first is, what assessments do you make for middle-income countries of the region post-pandemic, where Gulf support specifically is unlikely to come in significant quantities? And there's a specific reference to Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, and Lebanon. And the second is on the rentier states of the Middle East and the trading states. Do you expect for them to bounce back to their 2019 GDP levels first? And if so, when do you expect that to happen? Or do you consider an alternative arc for recovery in the region?
I would say the rentier states I think are going to be in huge trouble. Oil prices are not coming back to the levels that they expected anytime soon, and you know, tourism and the economy and the kind of economic activities that sustain the rentier states are not going to be there. So you know, they're going to go through prolonged periods of budget deficits. And I have to say that even before COVID hit, a number of them, like Kuwait, for instance, was already experiencing significant budget deficits. You have to remember, a lot of these countries need oil at $60, $70, $80, $90 a barrel in order to support you know, the kind of entitlement projects, grandiose expenditures that they have. Oil at 30, 40, or now 25, and it might go again down levels, means that the hole gets much, much bigger. So some of them can begin to eat into their very hefty sovereign wealth funds. That helps Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar for a period, but it's not really a big option for Oman or Kuwait or Iraq, let's say, in any significant way. They really don't have that much fat. And even the case of UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they have to roll back a lot of the projects that their nationalism and the legitimacy of their rulers was attached to, of, you know, transformation of these economies into something else. So then the question becomes, how quickly can they change themselves into a non-oil economies? For UAE and Qatar, let's say the pathway there is not very clear. Oman had already started this project a few years ago, but it's not that far in. And Saudi Arabia is actually coming from far behind. If you really put aside a lot of the language about Vision 2030, you know, the ideas of starting viable non-oil revenue generating industries in Saudi Arabia with Saudi workers, you know, that could be decades off, not matter of years off. So you're going to see rentier states actually struggle, and rentier states sometimes tend to struggle a lot more because they go from wealth to much greater poverty, and that has maybe not as much of an economic, is not as much of an economic problem, but it's much more of a political problem. Populations in rentier states are much more politically fickle because of what they're used to, as opposed to the populations of Egypt or Jordan or poorer countries. Now, your Egypts, your Jordans are going to have to join the very large number of middle income and poor countries that are right now have formed a long queue, I guess hopefully with 6 feet apart each, in front of the IMF, asking for emergency balance of payment loans to sort of sustain their economies. They have to begin to much more rapidly explore ways in which to provide exports, but they are also dependent on demand in the West for their goods, for their commodities opening up. And some of them are likely to do better. I would say probably Jordan or Tunisia are a little bit more robust, have handled it a bit better. They might be better positioned to do that. Egypt, I think, is going to have a much tougher time, largely because it's been much more addicted to Gulf support money, not just government aid from Persian Gulf countries, but also labor remittances. And it hasn't really done well with transformation of its economy, not at a scale that is necessary for a country the size of Egypt. And so the government's going to have a much tougher time. And what you're going to see in a lot of these countries is actually literally impoverishment of the population. You're going to see the middle class lose its footing, become poorer and poorer. The poor then become additionally poorer. And you know, the ultimate danger is that a lot of the parts of the Arab world is going to begin to look like sub-Saharan Africa, worst cases in sub-Saharan Africa. It doesn't mean necessarily complete regime collapse, but it's a kind of degradation of state and society that then would make pandemics, war, terrorism, conflicts, migration, refugees, all of these things much more likely.
I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to combine as you were just finishing up there, Vali. I was looking at 3-4 questions that seem to be getting at a similar point, and I think it's a salient one. And so I'm going to combine them. You mentioned there the IMF, and I think it's important to remember that the bulk of our discussion today has really looked at states and the state level effects, so to speak, both within the region itself, but also great power relations between the US and China. But of course, Henry Kissinger wrote recently that the world order as a whole is likely to change post-COVID, and rulers have to be ready for that, which brings into question some of the institutions born out of the last world order, the IMF, the UN, the EU to a large extent. Do you see these organizations and unions playing a significant role in the post-COVID Middle East context, especially when the EU also faces potential concerns around migration heading towards Europe, as they did in the aftermath of the Syrian civil war? So that role of the UN and the IMF, and to what extent can that be a bellwether for at least commercial interests to understand if they're, on the one hand, what kind of a recovery is likely to emerge, and on the other, will just the rules generally around the world order as it pertains to these sort of multilateral and supra institutions, will that change, and how?
So very good question. I would say the 2 most important factors about the future of these multilateral institutions, one is the US election in November. If you have a democratic administration come in and it's determined to address global issues multilaterally and wants to reach out to others, it might begin to invest in a major way in the World Bank, in the IMF, in the United Nations, and also shore up the European Union. If you have more of America first, you would say that these institutions are going to be very hard pressed to play an important role. It's everybody for themselves, the way it's going forward. The second issue is US-China dynamic. It depends on whether the United States really wants to engage China as opposed to the current trends which we are seeing, which is more of a blame game and a much more of a confrontational attitude. To basically have a global answer to the problems we're going to be facing post-COVID. And then the United States, particularly under a democratic administration, would look to bring China into the IMF more aggressively, to give it more voice at the UN, engage it much more, or the United States would like the European Union to be collectively dealing with China. So that also would give a much more impetus to these institutions. Much more immediately, I would say the United Nations is not as significant at this stage in handling the pandemic. We'll see, as I said, how these 2 trends go forward. The IMF is important particularly to middle income and low income countries, as they are going to face a tremendous amount of economic blow because of COVID. The key issue is, does IMF have capacity to be really relevant, right? I mean, if IMF is not able to address the kind of funding that is required to shore up institutions, does not have the kind of support from China and the United States to actually put down conditionalities for its loans, it's going to be quickly become much less relevant. And so that really comes down to, does the United States want to support some kind of a multilateral way of addressing poorer and middle income countries' needs, and to bring the Chinese on board, which means that they have to get together and fund IMF much more fully. They have to agree on IMF leadership, on IMF policies, on IMF conditionalities, and on a whole set of enforcement issues. And I think, therefore, those first 2 things are more important. What will happen in the US, and what happens to US-China relations?
Vali, thank you so much on behalf of GlobalWonks and our entire community of clients, experts, friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for kicking off our webinar series in such a rich, broad and varied way with all your insights on the Middle East and beyond. I think there's a lot to chew on and a lot for us to think about, especially over the next 12 months. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, this is Zoom, so you won't get the round of applause that your talk deserves. But I can tell you that 500 people signed up to the session today, and over 200 people have been present throughout the last hour. So I think that's indication enough of the interest in your insights. If any of you who have joined us today have got more questions like the ones we have discussed today and the kind of insights that Vali has covered, please sign up to GlobalWonks and ask them through our product network Pulse. That's why it exists, for us to deliver these kind of insights directly and quickly to clients around the clock. We've just kicked things off today. We'll be doing another webinar in 2 weeks' time with Rachel Ziemba, who is Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for Numeric and Security and was previously Head of Emerging and Frontier Markets and Head of Co-Head of Research at Rubini Global Economics. So on behalf of GlobalWonks, thank you so much, Vali, and I hope you'll all join us for the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.